talk this afternoon. It's by Neil Sinclair, and he is a local published historian. And the specialist subject this afternoon is on Tiger Bay to Cardiff Bay, if I got that right. Neil has broadcast on both Welsh television and Scottish television? Scottish television as well. And on the news yesterday? Yes, on the Welsh news yesterday. So you'll have seen his face on the television. Anyway, without any more further ado, can you please welcome Neil?
It's perfect, isn't it, the sound? Well, I'd like to thank you very much, the University of the Third Age in Porthcawl here, for inviting me to speak on my favourite topic, from Tiger Bay to Cardiff Bay. And as was mentioned by Chris, I do a lot of television, radio, and what have you on the same topic. And I'm also a published author, and what we're going to talk about, since we're talking about Tiger Bay, my first book was published in 1993 and was critiqued as the first insider's view on the community of Tiger Bay. Much maligned, stigmatized Tiger Bay. I was born there in World War II, and so many things have been said about Tiger Bay and what have you in a negative light that when I left home and went to university in America and returned in the 1990s, I was quite taken aback to find that the South Wales Echo continually resorted to the negative interpretation of the community. So I started to write to the Echo and say, well, that's not how it was. If you lived there, you would have lived an entirely different, or get an entirely different perspective. And so I wrote to several magazines, and eventually I'd written so many stories and what have you, it compiled into the book I just showed you. And then it's 20 years later, I'm still publishing, and I'm still talking about my favorite topic. So I hope that when I finish talking to you now, you'll have an insider's view. And one other thing is that there was a program on the television on BBC Wales again, called Cardiff Bay Lives. Now, many people in Tiger Bay resent being told that they come from Cardiff Bay, but that's neither here nor there. And on Cardiff Bay Lives, they had two young plumbers talking about the old bay, but they were too young really to remember the old bay as it was. And one of the things they said, which annoyed most people in the community, was Shirley Bassey didn't come from Tiger Bay at all, she came from Splot. Well, I'm here to rectify their misunderstanding. Shirley's whole family, except her two older sisters, who were born in the north of England, Liza, her mother, was from the north of England, all of them were born in Tiger Bay or the Docks. And her older sister, Gracie, was born in Loudon Square, which was the heart of Tiger Bay, and her twin brother and sister, Henry and Marina, were born on Evelyn Street down the Docks, and Shirley was born at 182 Bute Street. Of course, when she was a little girl, the family did move from the community to Splot. So that's how Splot can claim her, because she went to Moreland School over there, but the adult siblings that she had never lost their connection with the community they were born into, and neither did Shirley for that matter, because in her early days, she and a lot of the chorus girls in many shows came from our community and went to London, and obviously at some point, although they were doing background to famous artists, Shirley's voice became noticeable, and we know the rest of the story. But I'm not here to talk about Shirley Bassey, but I just wanted to rectify that fact. But so how did Tiger Bay come to be? And that's what we're going to discuss. So are there any Cardiffians here today? There's a few, so okay. I'm going to tell a potted history of how Cardiff came to be the city that we know it today. Because if we go back long before many of you can remember, I'm going to go back to 1811. Now, nobody's jump up and say you remember it well. Cardiff was a tiny village near Caerphilly with less than 2,000 people. And they lived around Cardiff Castle in St. John's Parish. The little village had two parishes. The other was St. Mary's Parish, the one where Tiger Bay is located and where I was born. And as I say, the majority of people lived around Cardiff Castle. At the same time in the Rhondda Valley, the Industrial Revolution was taking hold, with iron and then coal being excavated. And John Crichton Stewart, the second Marquis of Bute, who'd married into the wealth of South Glamorgan, his wife owned most of the land that we call St. Mary's Parish, decided he would build a dock to export the coal from the Rhondda Valley to the four corners of the world. Now, as I said, the majority of the inhabitants lived in the village around St. John's Church, which is an 11th century diocese. St. Mary's Parish, however, was virtually moorland, marshland, tidal in some way, so virtually no one lived there except those who lived alongside the Glamorganshire Canal. This was constructed in the late 1790s, I think 1799, and it came all the way down from Merthyr Tydfil down to Cardiff Castle and then eventually down to the sea. And that portion from St. Mary Street in the centre of town down to the seafront became the backbone which would eventually be Tiger Bay. Now, the area was officially known as Butetown, named after the Marquis of Bute. Now, if you watch TV Sunday night on BBC Two at 6 o'clock, there was a programme called Bute, the Scot who spent a Welsh fortune. Did anybody see it? Yes. Well, did you see me in it? Yes. Okay, yeah. And so, well, whenever historians come to Wales, or the media historians, and they want to do something on Cardiff, and particularly the docks, my name always comes up. So in the end, I end up being the one on telly to tell the story. But the name Butetown didn't exist when I was growing up. I didn't know where Butetown was. When anybody wrote a letter to our address, 19 Francis Street, it was Docks Cardiff, right? And nobody called it Butetown. And when the tram cars used to come all over Cardiff, and they ended up coming down Bute Street to get to the pier head, where Victorian pleasure seekers would disembark from the tram car, take their luggage over to the white funnel paddle steamers, and then get on board and take pleasure cruises across the channel to Ilfracombe and other exotic places on the English coastline, and maybe further up to Scotland. And there was the Cardiff Queen and the Balmoral and so on and so forth. When that tram car was coming down Bute Street, it used to say Pier Head, never Butetown, right? And so when I mention Tiger Bay, people now don't even really know where it is. Everywhere is Tiger Bay to anybody that goes there. Now they go down to Cardiff Bay and they think they're in Tiger Bay. I'm here to tell them they're not. And you have to be an insider and you have to live in the community to know where it is. Now, it's designated as North and South Butetown today, and you can see it on signs. So you could virtually say North Butetown was, or still is as far as I'm concerned, Tiger Bay, and South Butetown is the docks. Let me just distinguish the residential docks from the industrial docks. I don't mean the industrial docks, I'm talking about where the workers lived and the seamen lived. That was down the docks. And many of the streets in our area were named after members of the family of the Marquis of Bute. And of course, there was a main street through Tiger Bay called Sophia Street, named after the Marchioness of Bute, and it doesn't exist anymore, but we're jumping the gun. So anyway, back in the day when the Marquis was going to build the dock, he said, well, I need to build it, but unfortunately for him, this was the 1820s, 1830s, there was such a thing as the Chartist rebellions, social upheavals taking place in the South Wales community and other parts of the country, of course. But as a consequence of this upheaval, he was unable to get a local labour force to dig open the first of his industrial docks. Now, prior to this, there was a dock in Cardiff, and it was on the banks of the River Taff. But in those days, the River Taff flowed down Westcott Street. And Quay Street is still there to remind us that the old Cardiff docks that go back to the medieval times was located there. But this little dock on the side of a river was not going to be sufficient for the amount of tonnage that would eventually come down from the valley. So he wanted to build a grand dock. To overcome the fact that he had no labour force to do this, he imported 200 Irishmen into South Wales. And of course, Catholicism came with the workforce for the first time, because we're Presbyterian, Welsh Baptist, and so on and so forth. And I'll be telling you that a lot of the people who lived in Tiger Bay came from the valleys, and they were pure Welsh speakers. We had 4 Welsh-speaking churches in Tiger Bay and the docks at the time to accommodate these congregations. You all right, Dorothy?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, no, don't apologize, please. Anyway, he brought in the Irishmen, and they began to dig. They were the Navy force, and they opened up the first of the docks in 1839. This was a tremendous success for the first time. And remember, this is in the days of sailing ships. Ships would sail out of the dock laden with anthracite coal, the best on planet Earth. Not saying that because I'm Welsh, but it's just a matter of fact. God graced us with this. And off to the 4 corners of the world, the coal would go, as far away as China. As a consequence of this fact, when the ships returned laden with exotica from the Far East to come back to the port, oftentimes the crews would be Chinese as well. And in fact, it was the Chinese who formed the beginning of Tiger Bay, in that they were the first non-Europeans to settle at the seafront in Tiger Bay by marrying local Welsh women. So there's a lot of Chinese-descended families still in current Tiger Bay today. But this was the beginning of it. Now, as I said, that dock was very successful. So successful, it was necessary to build another dock to the east of it. And this is at this point in 1859, when the dock opened, they became known as the East and West Bute docks, and they become the industrial heart valve that was going to transform the village of Cardiff into a town, city, and the capital that it eventually came to be. But even these 2 docks weren't sufficient. By 1887, it was necessary to build the Roath dock, and that even couldn't compete with what was needed, so they eventually had to build the Queen Alexandra dock, the largest of Cardiff's docks, which is still a functioning dock to this very day. However, to build that dock, it was necessary to create the land out into the sea to build it. And an interesting anecdote related to that is, once the dock was created, it altered the currents and the flow of the sea in front of the city, while Penarth, which you all must have visited at some time in your life, is a pebbled, stoned beach, wasn't always pebble-stoned. It had beautiful golden sand until the Queen Alexandra dock was built, and for some reason it swept all the sand away, and Penarth has never forgiven us since. In fact, Penarth built its own dock to compete with Cardiff Docks, which is now the Penarth Marina, and they created their own Millionaires Row and got their mansions on the top of the hill, and they could look down on Cardiff and look down on us, so to speak. So it was because of this, the building of the docks, not only was it shipping, there was a necessity for other industries that supported the docks. The iron foundries, Geskin, Nuttlefold, and so on and so forth, the steel mills, and so on and so forth. So there was not only men going to sea, there were men coming from all parts of Wales and other parts of the British Isles, for that matter, to work on Cardiff docks, because it was a major employer, not only of the local population within Cardiff itself, but the whole of South East Wales. So if you lived, say, on Bute Crescent, which is near where the Welsh National Opera House is today, you might be woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning by the sounds of hundreds of men with hobnail boots marching towards the dock gates, which are also located opposite the entrance to the Opera House today. So I presume you've all been to Cardiff Bay and seen the new opera company and so on and so forth. But that was the entrance to the docks. And on either side of the docks were sentry boxes, just like outside Buckingham Palace. And there'd be police officers in there. It's the only people allowed on the dock were the men who worked there, or the sailors who sailed on the ships. Did that stop any kid from Tiger Bay or the docks going there? No. Now, your parents would say, don't play over the docks, don't play in the canal, don't play over the timber float. And where would you find all the kids from Tiger Bay and the docks? We'd make a beeline, watch the bobbies in their sentry box, we'd soon scoop around, and onto the docks we'd go. And it was a great adventure playground before any such thing existed. And when bowls tipped sand over there, it was like Barry Island had come to town. The word would go through the community, and all the kids would be rolling in the sand. Thousands of workers were there, and they never got annoyed with the children. They always accommodated us, give us rides on the trains that were shunting back and forth because Cardiff Docklands was scarred with railway lines all over the place. Most have disappeared. But it was a wonderful sight to see, which is part of my personal memory. You know, our parents were quite correct because lots of children lost their lives in the canal, in the mud flats in front of the city. As you know now, it's a grand lake, which I'll discuss when we get to the Cardiff Bay part, but in those days, it was a tidal wave, so that when the tide went out, there was nothing but mud at the seafront. And so if a child fell off the pierhead or off the ramp into the mud, they would instantly disappear in 20 feet of mud and would never come out alive. And we had those tragedies in the community. And we had this timber float at the top of the Glamorganshire Canal, at the top of the community. And all the timber that came from Norway or other parts of Scandinavia, hence the Norwegian and Scandinavian part of the community of Tiger Bay there, they would bring in the logs and they would come through the West Dock, through the West Junction Canal, across Bute Street and into the timber float, awaiting their journey to go up the valleys to prop up the mine pits. Now, these logs would be sometimes rectangular, sometimes triangular, but however the shape, they were all tied together so they made like great rafts on the lake surface. And we as kids from Tiger Bay used to go over there because it was our job to undo the logs and make canoes. And then we'd get on our canoes, and we'd have our paddles, and we'd sail across the lake having the greatest fun in our life. Of course, there was a man on the dock sitting in a hut whose job it was to catch us. So he'd get on his little boat and he'd chase after us in his boat and he'd have a long stick with a hook on the end trying to grab us. So it was the greatest fun to paddle our way to the other side and escape to freedom and have a good laugh and a lot of fun. Children fell off the logs. If you fell off the logs and went underneath, you couldn't come up for air because they were all tied together. This happened to Gloria Gauji, God rest her soul, she's still alive. And she would have drowned, but my brother Ronnie Sinclair was a champion swimmer from South Church Street School. So he dived in and he pulled Gloria out. And anytime I see her, if I get on the bus these days, as elderly as she is now, she says, "Oh, your brother saved my life," you know, yeah. So that sort of thing was typical for us in the area. Now, as the industrialism was going, and as I say, there was all these factory workers, as well as seamen like my father, my grandfather, and what have you, and everybody going away and coming back, the community was, by alchemy, creating a very unique phenomenon on the British Isles. This was a Welsh community that had every nationality you can imagine. There was more than 57 different nationalities in Tiger Bay and the docks. So let me just clarify now the geography. Tiger Bay is North Bute Town today, and that was all the homes above Hodges Row, which was the boundary line between the docks community and the Tiger Bay community. And the Hodges Road today is called Hodges Square, but in my childhood, there used to be a lock in there filled with water, and it led over to the Glamorganshire Canal, where there was a lock bridge. And so that's what kind of geographically separated us from the bay and the docks. So it was a situation like if you decided to go down the docks south of Hodges Row, somebody on Alice Street would say, "What are you doing down here? Get back up the bay." Or if somebody from down the docks would come over the Hodges Row and say, "What are you doing up the bay? Get back down the docks." But it was sort of like a community rivalry. It wasn't an enmity at all, because we regarded ourselves as one community. Unlike today, where we're now becoming balkanized and separated. And some people say to me, "I'll be doing a tour of the bay." which is what I used to do with the Cardiff Bay Development Corporation, and telling them about the historical parts and also showing them what was planned for the future. And sometimes people in my audience would say, oh, look over there, that's the Somali community. And I would say, excuse me, I said, that's the Tiger Bay community, and Somalis have always been a part of the community, but it's not the Somali community, it's the Tiger Bay community. But somebody, and it's particularly in academia, this is also, is trying to stress the differences between the Yemenis, the Somalis, and ourselves. And what's happening in today's world is the original Tiger Bay community still lives. Many are elderly, and we're burying a lot of our famous people in our community. But we are becoming a minority within our own community because things are changing, and we'll get around to how they come about changing very shortly. Now, I'd like you to know that at some point you can ask questions, and please feel free to interrupt if you need to know something, but we'll have a little question and answer towards the end. But anyway, life went on in Tiger Bay, and well, before I sort of approach what happened in the 1960s when a major demolition takes place, I'd like to paint a picture for you of what life was like in it, and I'll quote from my first book, The Tiger Bay Story, because when the demolition occurred, all our homes were being destroyed by the wrecking ball. Now, I should point out that the very first row of houses ever built in the docks by the Marquis of Bute is called Bute Crescent. And if you go to Cardiff Bay today, as they call it, you might recognize the Eli Jenkins pub, right? As a character from Dylan Thomas's Under Milkwood. Or Llagarib, I should say. Well, that row of houses, which was a crescent, the north and south ends have been lopped off, so it doesn't look like a crescent anymore, was the very first row of houses the Marquis built in the 1830s. And they've refurbished, and they're very grand. Well, there were houses in Loudon Square, up in the old Tiger Bay, equally grand, but they're no longer there because they fell victim to the demolition of the late 1950s, early 1960s. And I'll go into a little bit of detail on that a little later. Let me find my spot where I saw this reading light. Now, chapter 1. Now, because so many streets have gone, I wrote chapter 1 and called it Reminiscences of Streets No More. So bear with me while I just read a few passages. If my imagination took to the sky, I could almost see castles or even faces engaged in conversation in the formation of clouds above the narrow streets of Tiger Bay when I was a child. It was the same with our fireplace. At home, I used to sit in the living room in front of the fire, especially late in the evening after supper when it was getting dark. No television then. Our radio was situated on a shelf to the right of the fireplace above Mother's armchair. It was a Rediffusion. Dad's easy chair was opposite Mam's. I had a little stool placed between the two of them whilst we listened to the latest radio mystery. As a rule, the subject was too adult for me to comprehend. So practically every night I would find myself drifting into the fire between the dark coals inside to a burning, red-hot interior. There, when my imagination took wing, I saw many wondrous things. Many nights, witches flew from one castle of coal to another, sometimes leaving the impression of their faces embedded in the coals. What marvelous flights they took. Monsters and goblins appeared now and then, as occasionally gas would seep from the coal and blue and yellow flames would hiss out. Now, beside this fireplace was a scuttle where the coal was kept. If it was empty and Mam was all comfy, she used to say, "Go on, love, go get the coal for us." And although it was said in tenderness, it also meant, "Go get it." Now, wait a minute. On cold winter nights, I didn't enjoy getting it because the coal house was outside in the backyard. Sometimes Patsy Clark, the coal of North Church Street, would drop his sack in the cupboard under the stairs, but most of the time the coal was outside in the back, in the dog's house. Ruff, of course, lived inside with us. He shared his place by the fireplace with Farouk, our Persian cat. Anyway, I'd run out and shovel up the coal and rush back to my warm stool near the fire, hoping to return to the same mystical land where the fire had taken me before. Unfortunately, the same path through the coals was impossible to rediscover. Nevertheless, with the magic of the fire and my innocent imagination, it wasn't hard to find a new place to explore. Meanwhile, my parents would still be engrossed in a mystery which pervaded the living room by means of another magic, the wireless. While they were there, I would follow a beckoning friend into the warmth between the coals, on into the glowing center of the earth. "You're not going to sleep again, are you, love?" Mam's voice would ring out. "Why don't you go to bed?" Mam always had a way of giving orders while asking questions, and Dad had a way of finalizing everything she said. "Well, you heard your mother. Off you go then." And sadly, off I'd go up the stairs into my cold room and bed. But some nights, by the gaslight, the mantles of which were above the fireplace, Mam would tell me a story. It was a dark and stormy night, and the captain said to his mate, "Tell us a yarn, mate." And the mate began. It was a dark and stormy night. I laughed as I jumped off my mother's knee when I first ever heard that recursive sea yarn. Many nights a story would be told sitting by the fireplace in our little Victorian terraced house, one of 26 such houses on Old Francis Street, a street now gone some 30-odd years. 19 Francis Street was where I first became aware of the world, and that world was the 1940 seaport community of the already legendary Tiger Bay, known to seamen everywhere. So that excursion takes you into my book, which is not an autobiography, just telling my story, but I couldn't figure out how to tell the story of Tiger Bay except through my eyes as a child, the street I was born on, the games we played in the street, and then who lived on the streets beyond. And so as you read in my book, you go into other streets and you meet other characters of the bay and learn about the history of the area and how it came to be. Now, as I told you, there was lots of people, there was 57 different nationalities, which meant 57 different languages were spoken on the streets as a commonplace. Now, when you're growing up, you just think the world is like this. It's not till you leave a place like Tiger Bay that you realize this was unique. Now, among the people who spoke Welsh, gan cynnwys bobl oedd yn siarad Cymraeg. There was loads of people who spoke Welsh. And as I mentioned a little earlier, we had 4 Welsh-speaking churches in Tiger Bay. One was in Loudon Square, and it was called the Bethania. Now, it's gone with everything else in our country, because everything that the Marquis of Bute inspired was either in the Georgian, Edwardian, or Victorian architectural style. Well, most of that kind of architecture in Tiger Bay was demolished in the 1960s when I guess the word came out of Cardiff, well, it was Cardiff City Council at the time, let's get rid of Tiger Bay. And one of the things is they couldn't get rid of the community, so they thought if they demolished it, maybe that would get rid of it. What was it they were trying to get rid of? Well, there was a street in Tiger Bay, I mentioned it earlier, called Sophia Street. And on the corner of Sophia Street and Angelina Street was a pub called the Marchioness of Bute. Now, before I talk about that corner, I should say nearly every street corner had a pub. On Francis Street, we had the Westgate. And in fact, there was originally 147 pubs, all the way from the top of Bute Street down to the docks, the seafront, and in the side streets. Only Loudon Square didn't have any pubs. And now there's none, believe it or not. There's none today. But at the particular pub, the Marchioness of Bute, what made it so interesting, it was like Angelina Street was like, which crisscrossed, was like the show of life, so to speak, because around both corners of the Marchioness of Bute, all the seamen that just come from the ships, or the dock workers, had come there, and it would be like North Africa, like a Casbah. It was like the open-air Las Vegas casino. Now, of course, in those days, now gambling was illegal. There was no lottery and all that business and scratch cards that we got today. It was quite normal. In those days, this was an illegal activity. But all the seamen would come, all the dock workers from the Mount Stewart Dry Dock, as soon as that whistle went, they flooded out into the streets onto their bikes, either into the pubs or to that corner. And they would have schools of gambling games. So there'd be a penny school where they played pitch and toss, a sixpenny school, a shilling school, and what have you. And the seamen gambled away their wages before they even went home to see their wives and slapped the money on the table. But it was an activity that created a hubbub there. Now, the normal day life for the people of Tiger Bay was very Welsh in the sense that, as I mentioned, many of our grandmothers were from the valleys and what have you. So we had that valleys type atmosphere. Everybody was our auntie, everybody was our uncle, but every street, weather permitting, when their front doors were wide open, and often the elderly, not only the elderly, but often the elderly would just take their nice easy chair and put it outside the front door on the pavement. So streets like Sophia Street, Nelson Street, Maria Street became like community living rooms. So the elderly would sit there, kids would run around the elderly, and if they got to talking, they'd say, get away, we're talking adult things, you're not supposed to listen. So we would play, you could, let me just say this. There used to be an old Arab man called Aloisi, and he had a little horse and cart, and he was like a rag and bone man or what have you. But for sixpence, or was it threepence? I can't remember, threepence or sixpence, he could let you climb on the back of this wagon, and off you go out of the community, down Penarth Road, which in those days was nothing but fields. And you'd have tins with you, and you could pick all the blackberries you wanted and have a ball for the whole day long, as long as you were back by tea. Now, what mother would let their children disappear from the community today like we could then, you know? And then he'd bring you back to wherever you lived, and you'd run home and you'd have these tins, and your mothers would make tarts and pies with all the, if you haven't eaten everything in the tin by the time you got home with all the stuff over you. But this was a sort of a day-to-day activity. Well, back to the show of life, as I was mentioning. Not only were the gamblers there doing what they do, as I said, the ladies were sitting on their seats and the thing, and we kids would be playing in the street, all the different street games, and I'll read a little bit about that in a second. And Manuela, because we had a lot of Spaniards or people from the Basque country. And Manuela used to sit on a step with everything but a mantilla on her head, which was really Spanish. And her English wasn't that good. But the gamblers would be gambling, and she'd look down down Sophia Street to Bute Street. Now, on Maria Street on the corner was a police station. And it was a police station where the police officers and their families lived there. So they were really an integral part of the community. But the officer bobbies would come along in twos, and they'd get to the corner by Owen's the chemist, and Manuela would see them, and she'd shout across the road, heads up! So all the gamblers would stop gambling, hide the money, or sometimes they'd run across the road and throw it over the back wall into Manuela's garden, right? So then, in the meantime, the police officers would come down there, we're kids, we're playing, we might even have the one-man band doing the okey pokey and all that. And then it would all go quiet, and the police would see nothing, no contraband or anything. So they'd walk all the way down to Loudon Square. And once they disappeared, the dice started to roll, and life went back to normal on the corner. Now, if they got caught off guard, and like I told you, they threw the money over Manuela's wall, like that, when the police had gone, they'd have to go knock Manuela's door and say, Manuela, our dice, our money's in your back garden. Now, I told her she couldn't speak English that well, so she'd sit there and go, oh, well, all right then. She said, you give me money, I give you dice. And then she'd give them that. It was all in jest, I suppose, you know what I mean? Because she's quite a character, and, pre-television, so many communities had people who had larger-than-life personalities, and you needed it. But why did I call the street the show of life? Because all along Angelina Street were famous people, became famous, like Joey Erskine, the boxer from the Erskine family. in the 1950s when he won. There was a big celebration in Angelina Street, and everybody was singing calypsos, hold him, Joe, hold him, Joe. And so all this was great fun, because we had lots of processions in the street, because also on Sophia Street was what we called the Zawiya, which was some sort of, wasn't a mosque as such, but it was a place where the Arab men used to go and pray and go in circles, and there was some sort of chanting. Ooh, ooh, you could hear them. It wasn't exotic to us, but it was really interesting. But like on what we called Arab Christmas, which is politically correct, Ramadan, but it was, for us, it was Arab Christmas. They would provide food on tables like you did on the coronation day when the Queen, everybody had tables in the streets. Well, this was a normal thing in Tiger Bay on these celebrations. And they would parade in a traditional costume and march through the streets with colourful banners and singing all the Arab songs. And everybody in the community, Arab or whatever, followed behind, because everybody seemed to like a parade in Tiger Bay and march through the streets. This sort of thing went on with the Wesleyan in Loudon Square. They had the Boys Brigade and the Girls Brigade, and they had marching bands, and they just, when you heard the sound, everybody come running up to the house and march behind. It was just the way of life. It was a rich cultural exchange. From the perspective of the city fathers, though, it was a den of iniquity. All these white ladies from the valleys had married Arabs, Malays, Indians, and it was like unheard of. And they couldn't possibly be respectable women, even though they were married in St. Mary's Church or in the mosque or whatever. That was disregarded. They just couldn't. They had to be women of ill repute. Not to say there weren't some who, because when you have a dockland and what have you, you always have camp dwellers who come by waiting for the men on payday to satisfy that. So that did exist, but it didn't. I mean, and those ladies of the night often came from far afield, as London and Leeds and what have you. They weren't necessarily the local people, because you couldn't run the docks without a labour force. All our grannies and the old ladies and the women of our community were the char ladies in all those offices. Mount Stewart Square, where the coal exchange was located. 5 o'clock in the morning, Tiger Bay ladies and docks ladies would go down there, go into the basement of the coal exchange and get the coal and take it up the stairs, and around the balcony in the main hall were all these different businesses, surveyors and bankers and brokers and what have you, and they'd light all the fires in all the offices, get them nice and cozy and warm, so that when the men came to the building and they walked in their offices, they were all cozy and warm and the fires were going. But you didn't see a single woman, because it was anathema for a woman to be in the coal exchange when business began. And on the large wooden floor, a woman couldn't put her foot on it, except under penalty of death at dawn, right? So, but women were in there because they were doing the work. And as in all the other offices, the shipping clerks' offices, they were always being cleaned or polished by local Tiger Bay women. Their husbands were on the ships. So really, without the labour force from Tiger Bay and the docks, there wouldn't be any wealth in Cardiff, because even though it's the idea of the Marquis of Bute and the colliery owners and what have you, you still needed the people to do the work, and these were the people that did the work, and that's how Cardiff became a wealthy city. How wealthy? In 1920, there was a bank on Bute Street called the National Provincial Bank of England. 1924, it moved across the road and became the NatWest Bank building, and it was a magnificent building with Greco-Romano architecture, mahogany doors, and all the other major banks were there, Lloyds, Barclays, and what have you. And in fact, that part of there was the business community of the docks, was the largest financial establishment outside the square mile in London. So that shows you how important Cardiff came to be. And more important than that, at the coal exchange, a deal was made, and the first £1 million cheque ever signed in the world was signed right there in Mount Stewart Square. So that gives you an idea of the wealth. But you can look at the wealth in disconnection to the people who did the work that made the wealth possible. But those people who made the wealth possible have become denigrated and stigmatized, because Tiger Bay, no decent person went to Tiger Bay. it was always a talk about don't go down there and what have you. And I write about that in my books. But most of the people who had that negative view never set foot in Tiger Bay. Now, I've been doing these lectures for years, and often when I talk to groups, I'll always find somebody who used to be a clerk in the coal exchange or what have you. But I remember meeting, I was up the valleys, and this woman said, well, I used to work in the Pier Head building. I said, right. And so she said, and I used to leave there when the work was over, and I'd walk up Bute Street alongside the embankment where the Taff Vale Railway is. And she said it was so fascinating. And when you got to Loud Square and you looked in, you'd see men with turbans on their head and so on and so forth. And she just reveled in it. So anyway, she went to a dinner party once. And so the topic of Tiger Bay came up and how terrible place it was. And you shouldn't go there. And so she said, oh, well, where's this place? And so they were saying, what do you mean, where's this place? She said, well, I've never seen anything like that. And so she said, well, you know it because you work down there. She said, where? So she said, you work down the pier? She said, yeah, well, up that beauty. And she said, well, you're crazy. She said, because she walked in pure safety every day of her working life up and down that street and was just fascinated with it. So it's kind of like a mythology that grew up. So if you never went there, and of course, if you're one of the unfortunates who were told not to go there, you missed out because Tiger Bay had the nightlife. Now remember, this is in the days when the pub shut at 10 o'clock. But not in Tiger Bay. Of course, they shut at 10 o'clock, but the blackout curtains from the war came down, and the pub was still jumping all night long. And so people, especially artists, they come to the New Theatre to do a performance, famous people and what have you. After their performance in town, they always made a beeline to Sam On Yen's, the first Chinese restaurant in Wales, which was on Bute Street, or to the Bombay, the first Indian restaurant in Wales, which was on West Bute Street. So you'd always find people coming down there because for artists, the bohemian style of life they lived was complementary to the freewheeling lifestyle of the people who lived in Tiger Bay in the docks, who were constantly singing and making their own music. And here's another anecdote from an old octogenarian. He was probably deceased by now. He told me about 15 or 20 years ago. He's from Llanharan. And I had a model of the Cardiff Bay development, and the barrage wasn't even built, but it was on the model. And he said, well, where's Bute Street on it? I said, right there. He said, nothing wrong with Bute Street. I said, what do you mean? He said, I used to go there all the time. He said, when I was a young lad, I was a rugby player. So they used to go down to Westcott Street to where the Welsh Rugby Union is now, but there was a clubhouse there. And he said, we would always play our games, and when the game was over, whether they won or lost, the club would always put on barrels of beer and sandwiches for them. He said, but when the game was over, we didn't stay for the beer and the sandwiches. We made a beeline for Bute Street because we'd like to get down to the Loudon pub, which Johnny Erskine used to own, because everybody in there used to sing, and the boys from the valleys used to love to sing too, so they'd be in there singing their Sospen Vach and all the calypsos and all the songs that were local to Tiger Bay. So they said they just couldn't get over the freewheeling lifestyle. And they always got a kiss from Ruby, the black lady who was the landlady of the pub at the time. And it was amazing that this older man was telling me this, and I know he was telling the truth because I knew the characters he was referring to, but he had such pleasant memories of it. So he was one of the few who didn't not come down the bay, and obviously there was lots of people like him that did that. But I'm going to, before I go to the Demolition, I just want to take you to see how the kids played. We were like a rainbow family of kids on the streets, and the games we used to get up to. So I'll just read that passage, and then we'll, because I know time flies when we're talking, and sometimes I don't know when to stop myself. So, we're kids playing in the streets, and so another game of which kids in Tiger Bay were fond of was Rat-Tat Ginger, the best way to annoy otherwise peaceful households. Members of the Francis Street kids would be dared to knock someone's door and run away. But as this was Tiger Bay, you had to be ingenious. One night, while hiding around the corner by the Westgate pub, Anthony Evora, Johnny Lima and I tied a long string of wool onto Mrs. Alley's door knocker in Francis Street and pulled. Anthony had taken the ball of wool from his mother's knitting basket under penalty of a severe thrashing with a cane from his mother should she ever find out. Anyway, in the darkly illumined, gaslit street, old Mrs. Alley didn't see the string when she came out. So we waited a goodly time for all to get comfortable and pulled again, all the while sniggering to our clever selves. Nothing happened. Pull it again, said Johnny. And we pulled, only someone seemed to be pulling the other end. As we peered around the corner, there was Miriam Alley, Mrs. Alley's daughter, in all her fury. As she threatened to do us murder, we quickly scampered down to our hiding place behind the park wall in Loudon Square, thanking God for our close escape. On another occasion, behind the same wall, I was dared to knock Mrs. Lafeur's door. This Maltese family home was near the lamppost on the north side of Loudon Square, near the parkee's hut, as we called the little house the parkeeper stayed in during the day. Well, with the lamplight shining onto the door, pulling this family's knocker was a dangerous enterprise. On the other hand, the Lafeur's had a great elaborate knocker which was hard to resist. So reluctantly, I crept over the wall and up to the door, then knocked and ran for cover. Alas, nothing happened, and I was dared to go do it again. So over the wall I crept. Just as I was lifting the knocker, the door flung open, and there was Mrs. Lafeur in her pinafore, sweeping broom in hand. I fled back across the street and over the wall. The others were already running across the park for their lives. Here comes Mrs. Lafeur, scaling the park wall, running behind us all the while, swinging the broom in the air. Our youth outran the old dear, but the broom only missed us by inches when she was flinging it. But more of this later, as it is too soon to venture far away from Francis Street. That's also from the beginning of the book. But anyway, all this was going on in this freewheeling lifestyle, and the council or the powers that be decided all this must come to an end. How are we going to stop the gambling? We can't arrest them all, and because the Black Mariahs used to come in those days, and so that was a big excitement for everybody to come running out to see what was going on. Oh, I mentioned that Joey Erskine was born on that street, on Angelina Street, but also was Billy Boston, famous rugby player, as well as Victor Parker, famous for his jazz guitar. So it was the street to go. My sister used to work for the civil service, and she could take a shortcut through the canal and come home for lunch and go back. But nobody would take the shortcut. You had to go out of your way to go down Angelina Street because you didn't know what you was missing. So there was always something to come home and talk about when you went down that great street. Well, anyway, the powers that be decided this cannot last forever. We're going to get rid of it. We'll get rid of Tiger Bay. So their thing was to condemn the community. Now, these are grand buildings that the Marquis of Bute was responsible for. Those grand tenements that were built, or townhouses, real townhouses that were built in Loudon Square, had wrought iron spiral staircases externally on the outside, on the rear, and wrought iron railings everywhere and what have you. They came in with a wrecking ball from the Great Western Railway to the north and started to move south, and all these magnificent buildings were disappearing all along Bute Street, because Bute Street was quite a high street, like Queen Street would have been today. It was quite a business street, ships, chandleries and butchers and jewelry shops and pawn shops and so on and so forth. And as I say, it was a multi-mix of people, Jewish community, Arab community, all in there together. Well, the bulldozers came down to Loudon Square, but now Loudon Square being a park, which in fact the Marquis of Bute granted to the people in perpetuity as a beautiful place. Well, it was really built for the wealthy people. Those grand homes were the people who owned the collieries, and or they were professionals, doctors and surveyors and so on and so forth. And of course, as as I say, a great deal of wealth was made earlier in the century, a lot of those wealthy people these homes were built for decided that there wasn't a place to live anymore because the area was becoming extremely industrial. So they built Cathedral Road with mansion-like homes, and they moved there, or they absorbed out of villages like Roath, and they moved over to there. But the homes, those single-family dwelling homes they left behind, got split up into seamen's boarding houses. So even though they still had the chandeliers and all the great ornamentation, great balustrades and the tiled halls, but they were made into, say, Malay boarding house, Egyptian boarding house, and so on and so forth. Well, anyway, the bulldozers now came. Because the park was an empty space, they were able to build 2 tower blocks soaring up into the sky in the heart of the community. And once they were up, they could move people out of their homes and then just get rid of the rest and build this lackluster council estate. Now, it's historical in and of itself, because this is the first time a council estate was dropped down on top of a pre-existing multi-ethnic, multi-generational community. Usually, council estates were built in greenfield sites on the edge of Ely and what have you, and people moved out to them. But this time, they destroyed a pre-existing community and I don't know if they expected the life to continue as it was, but once you've built a tower block, the street life disappears, because who's going to stand on the doorstep inside a tower block like they would every day? It was people's duty to be on that doorstep to see what was going on with the world. They broke all that down, and so the rest of the community disappeared, and then we had this lackluster council estate architecture, which no tourist wants to see, because if you've seen one council estate, you've seen them all. There was nothing unique. So it was what we call locally municipal vandalism. Well, it started in 1958 when they built Hodges Square out of Hodges Row. That too was able to, because all they had to do was fill in a lock and they could build on top of the lock. But then they started building the tower blocks in Loudon Square in 1958. They opened in 1964. And then the rest of the community perished as a consequence, with no regard to. I mean, that meant that people were actually, like Alwyn Watkins was sitting on the steps to a grand home in Loudon Square, and some man come along, a bureaucrat, and said, "Well, where do you want to go, love? Langnishire, Lanramy, St." She said, "I'm not going up there, so I'm staying here. You've got to get out." "I don't have to get out," Alwyn said. "Oh, yes, you do." And so, in tears in her eyes, because it was inevitable, but she refused, like my parents and like so many people, refused to leave the community, and we ended up living in the flats. And ironically for Alwyn, who was Alwyn Blackman's first one of the school teachers in the area, her new home was built on top of the old home, but the old home was far grander in architectural stature than the modern house. But she's on exactly the same piece of land that she was born in, you know, but nothing to shake a stick at. It's called Swedish modern or what have you. But, and so we lost that portion of the community. By the 1980s, as the bulldozers went further south, Alan Michael, who was the local at the time, put a conservation order on what was left of the docks, especially the coal exchange, because the coal exchange was earmarked for destruction as well. And so the bottom end of the community, many of the old buildings have been salvaged. And so I like to go down there because I can look at Butte Crescent down on the waterfront by the seawall, and it kind of, it's a little mini Loudon Square as it was, you know. And I live in Loudon Square today, and I can tell you this, I have to grin and bear the fact that this architecture is there, because it is, and you have to face reality. But when I go to bed and sleep at night, I'm sleeping in old Tiger Bay. But nobody can take that away from me. And I've got all the photographs of old Tiger Bay that even the BBC don't have. Not old Tiger Bay, of old Loudon Square and its grandeur. And in fact, me and the Scottish Television's crew, we did a Loudon Square piece, and using the photographs that I supplied them, and they loved it. They said I was so passionate and what have you. But then I get a message from Shona Robinson in Scotland, and she said, the commissioner for BBC Wales said they want to take the Loudon Square piece out. And they didn't want it to come out, but they had to for whatever reason. And they said, why? And they said, because the BBC intends to do their own Loudon Square. So I don't know what they're up to. But there's enough of me in Butte, the Scot who spent a Welsh fortune, to compensate for the fact they took that out. But we filmed it anyway. And so, yes, so that now, okay, so that brought, and of course, at the time of the demolition, the dockland itself was also going into decline. And shipping wasn't important. Why? Because the British Navy went to petrol. Sailing ships went, and when petrol came into the picture, coal became less important, and so the docks started to close down, and many of the docks became derelict, and the businesses surrounding the docks. It wasn't complete because there was still work going on, but it wasn't like it was in its heyday in the 1920s. and what have you. So obviously something would have to be done, and there was a plan. I won't go into the Buchanan plan for the improvements of Tiger Bay, or Buttown as they were beginning to call it, because once the new council estate was created, they called it Buttown. And you see Buttown on the community centre, and you see Buttown on the buses. So the people who live there now, who have no historical roots in the area, call it Buttown, and they're beginning to outnumber us who still call it Tiger Bay. That went, and then we passed through the 80s, and I wasn't there at the time because I went over to America to get my university education. But in the meantime, the Cardiff Bay Development Corporation came into existence in 1987. And so when I come home, people in the Bay was going, oh, they brought in this new development corporation to finish us off. He said, what the council couldn't do in the 60s, they're going to do now. So everybody was a bit alarmed, and I was thinking, oh my goodness, are they really going to do this? So by then, I started writing the reports to the newspapers and what have you about old Tiger Bay, and eventually I published my work. So I became known, and people were buying newspapers to see what I had to say. Now, there was local people who objected to what I said, like Peggy Farrugia from the old Maltese community, and so often people would say, what did Peggy say? What did Neil say? You know, and so that kind of rivalry was going on within the community. But the Cardiff Bay Development Corporation wanted to, improve the area, right? In fact, they took 2,700 acres of the dockland to create what is now called Cardiff Bay. Now, can you all recall the Garden Festival Wales in the Ebbw Vale? 1992, as I've just been reminded. Well, Cardiff Bay Development Corporation, as an equal opportunity employer, said they wanted to create 30,000 new jobs for the whole of the South East Wales area, but they certainly should have created jobs for the people who immediately lived on the docks, who were now unemployed, and still are. And so they advertised a job for somebody to go up to Garden Festival Wales to promote the barrage and what everything was going to be done. So I show up to look for it, to go for the job. I won't go into all the details. It's a long. It could be an hour-long story itself. But and so they were surprised that somebody from the community had the degrees and what have you, and so there was no way they could put me in, fob me off with a useless job. So I went for the managerial job. But they gave the managerial job to somebody from Whitchurch. And I said, well, that's hardly employing somebody locally when you know. So they didn't know what to do because I had the qualifications. So I said to them, well, this job is 7 days a week, 13 hours a day. No one man is going to do that. I said, so you're going to have to split the managerial job into two and have one work 4 days, the other 3, and they rotate that. So that's how it happened. So I went up the valleys. And there was a big lake down there, and at the end of the lake was this huge fountain that you could actually walk underneath. Well, I was the man that turned that on every morning and turned it off at night. And I used to have a model. Let's put these two tables together, and in the model was a glass cover, was a picture, a model of the barrage to be, and on the wall was a beautiful, sunny, blue sky seafront view of Cardiff. Excuse me. And I forgot that was on my face. And so my job then was to sell this to the public. And I used to always get these older ladies just to come up behind me and say, young man, I said, well, what about the birds? What are you doing when they build the barrage? So I didn't have the answers to all these questions. So I go down to Mount Stuart Square, Baltic House, and I would tell them all the questions, they'd give me the answers, and then I'd go back up there. So this is how I began to get all my knowledge about what was going to be, and why the Development Corporation preferred me is because I had my finger on the pulse from the past, the present, and what they intended to do, so they kept me informed with the future. Now, why would they need a barrage? Well, one of the things I used to do was take business people around the bay on a bus. It was a 2-hour journey, and try to seduce them into building their offices and their factories. So when they built them on the old derelict docks, then they were employing people from the local area. And so anyway, cut a long story short, I take him over to Penarth because it's an elevated point, and you could see the whole of Cardiff from there on a nice, bright, sunny day. You could see the Caerphilly Mountains in the distance and the waterfront in front. And so all these people I'd taken, whether they came from China, even a Disneyland crew came, they were going, oh my God, this is a well-kept secret. This is beautiful. Look at this view. And I would say, yes, this is it, and so why don't you bring your businesses here? And then I go take them back and report back to the Baltic House. Then Baltic House would call me a week or two later for the same group, and they said, the people I took before, they want you to take them again because they're really considering coming, so they wanted a second view. Of course, when I got them that day, and the bus goes up to Penarth, the sun is behind the clouds. The clouds are everywhere, so you can't even see the Caerphilly Mountains. It's dull and horrible looking, and when they looked down at the waterfront, there was nothing but mud. They said, what's that? I said, well, the tide's gone out. They said, yes, but when does it come back? And I'd have to tell the truth, of course. I said, well, it can take 6 to 19 hours to return because we have the second highest tidal range in the whole of the world. We come second to the Bay of Fundy, which has a 70-foot tide, and we come in with a 44-foot tide, which floods into the bay, or the docks, and up the 3 rivers of Cardiff, the Ely, the Taff, and the Rumney on the east side. And they were going, oh no. And so the problem for them was, well, who wants to build an office or a home on a waterfront where there's no water? So Cardiff Bay Development Corporation knew quite early in the project, they had a 10-year lifespan, that if they didn't do something about the waterfront, they're not going to attract enough businesses to create 30,000 new jobs. So that's when the idea of building a barrage came up. And of course, when that went out, there were people thought it was a dam, and therefore Cardiff was going to be flooded, which wasn't hysterical paranoia. Cardiff was flooded, if you can remember the 60s and the 70s, the centre of town was flooded. But that was flooded not because of anything that happened at the seafront, but because the River Taff, which flowed from the Rhondda, and if there was a heavy downpour in the Rhondda, more water was coming through the north part of Cardiff than the banks of the rivers could hold. And so the rivers would overflow into the land of fields, and that water would come down Cathedral Road, rats and all swimming with it, into the centre of town, and what's that seal, Billy the Seal in Victoria Park, escaped and ended up in the centre of town from those floods. So people were remembering that really is the thing. But since those floods, the Cardiff engineers had deepened the bank so that prevented that from happening in the city, although it started to happen further up somewhere in the valleys, but that was not our problem, was it? And so so you can't really overcome nature by these little band-aid features. So people were thinking, so my job was to tell them up the valleys, it is not a dam. There were 5 sluice gates in there. So if there was a heavy downpour and it flooded into the lake and it reached a dangerous level, the sluice gates would open, and as long as the tide was out, the water could escape. And then there was also a fish pass, because the fish had to gain access to the rivers. Now, of course, the Ely River was the main sewerage river for Cardiff, so it had unsavoury smells coming from it, and so the Development Corporation had to regenerate the river itself and divert the sewerage flows from the river, because otherwise the lake itself would become a cesspool. So they eventually created their 500-acre lake in front of the city, and that was to be the attraction point to get the businesses and make Cardiff, South Wales, or the Welsh capital, successful again. They couldn't foresee the 2007-2008 financial crash, because that brought an end, a kibosh, to this whole thing, because all they were doing, if they saw an empty space, they said, build a block of flats. And so everywhere around my community now, there are all these new blocks of flats, many of them are half empty, filling every spot. Now, with the Development Corporation, at least when they were building, they had the Cardiff Bay Art Trust. So they said, if we're going to build buildings here, we've got to have art there as well. So some sort of monument or some sort of little park would be created to go with it. But once it handed over to Cardiff, by then it was a unitary authority. South Glamorgan and Cardiff City Council became the Cardiff County Council. Once their planning department got a hold of it, if there's a space, build a block of flats, and that's what they're doing up to this moment, even though that's an irrelevancy, given that the neoliberal economic system is now in free fall because things are going wrong. I won't go into all that, but I was talking about that to Doug earlier. He said, you ought to come back and tell us all about that. So maybe the next time you see me, I'll be talking about the neoliberal economic system. But I see Tiger Bay as a microcosm of what's going in the world today. So exactly what happened to us as a small community is happening to communities all over in this globalized economy. It's happening to people all over the world, you know, and it's so sad. But anyway, you can see I'm passionately engaged in my past. And now somebody give me a time check. How much time have we got so I can have questions? Would anybody like to ask questions at this point? Okay. You put this up first, so you go.
I'm Newport born.
There you are.
Was there any association between Newport?
Absolutely. Let me just add Barry, because Barry had a docks and Newport has a docks, like the Pill and all that area, Commercial Street and all that. And because it was a docks and it did similar things, maybe on a smaller scale compared to what was going on in Cardiff docks, so you had seamen from all over the world going to Barry docks and to Newport docks. And sailors, because they travel, intermarry with those communities. So a lot of people in Tiger Bay had relatives from Scotland, from Liverpool, and Newport. And so we were always making trips down to Newport because a local Tiger Bay girl or a docks girl had married a seaman that's based in Newport, you know? And Thompson Street in Barry Dock was exactly the same. And as far as I understand, that's not there anymore. And they built a council estate there. So I won't go to Barry Dock because I have these wonderful memories of old Barry Docks. And if I go there and see what they've done to it, it'll spoil it. So I'm not going there to see it. But yes, there's a connection. You were the next one.
Why they called Tiger Bay?
Well, now if you buy my book, it tells you all. Now, these books go in for $9.99 in shops, but if you do want a copy of my book, which I brought with me, you can have it for £5 or anything you buy from me today. But in the preface, I talk about it. Now, there's two myths. And there used to be, as I told you, there was 147 pubs back in the day, and people in Tiger Bay, before jukeboxes and before the modern world as it is now, without TV and all that, you had to make your own fun. And every pub had a piano, and somebody, whether they were schooled in music or not, there was always people who could just put their hands on a piano and make music. And so they were plonked down, and everybody had to sing along. So you sang in chorus, and and everybody had to do a turn as well. So you know, sometimes you're playing in the street, and the kids would go, "Oh, get down the Westcott, have a look, your mother's singing in there." So you'd have to climb up because you couldn't go in, and look through the window to see whoever's mother was doing a performance, right? So there were songs that they sang, music hall type songs, and one of them had the lyric of Tiger Bay in it, so that was often sung. And so some people say the name came from those songs. But at the same time, one of the ethnic groups that sailed in often were from Portugal or Portuguese colonies like Cape Verde. And these sailors used to sail into... Now, I mentioned we had the second highest tidal range in the world, so the current in there is difficult to navigate. So the ships coming into Cardiff docks had a bit of a time trying to get through the rough waters of the bay. So the Portuguese sailors used to say, after they successfully docked in the East Dock or the West Dock, they would say sailing into, in their own language, they would say sailing into Cardiff docks was like sailing through una Bahía de los Tigres, or through a Bay of Tigers. And so between that folklore from the seamen and the song, they say that's where the name came from. Now, Ivana Prida said, her grandfather said there used to be a man who used to walk around Loudon Square with 2 tigers on a leash. Now, you can take that with a grain of salt, but that was one of the rumors, you know? But yes, so if you read the book, you'll find a few explanations for where the name came from, right here.
What was your opinion of the rejection of Zaza Hadid's design?
I met Zaha at the time, and God rest her soul, she's passed on now. I think that was disgraceful on the part of the Welsh body. I think it was racist. And I think, you know, at that time, Tony Blair had gotten us all to go and bomb the hell out of Iraq on false pretenses. And so Iraqis weren't the favoured people politically. And I guess because she was Iraqi, they've ganged up. Now, it's wrong because they had a competition and she won it. Then they closed the competition and opened it again. And I think her design was superior to the one we have, right? And also, though, I had to promote the design that we do have. And the model was beautiful, and it's not quite captured by the reality, because the shell over it, on the model, it was all rounded. There were no sharp edges. But in the actual manufacture of the building, it's all sharp edges, because they couldn't really recreate the model version, you know. So I was disappointed, personally. But we have it and we live with it, like the loss of Tiger Bay itself. Any others? Yeah.
Can I just show you use the mic? Go.
You gave us some wonderful stories, anecdotal ones of the boys running around and mischief,
Yeah.
and also saying that so many things were happening there at that time, which led perhaps to some controversies going on. But when it came to why it was that they suddenly wished to change the whole character, I haven't quite picked up what it was. Was there some crime or criminality coming in? Because
Well,
to have done away with, and as you said, the bombing of those wonderful buildings that were all the way along there,
Yes.
there must have been some fundamental reason that they were able to actually state.
I wrote a book called Endangered Tiger, A Community Under Threat. And it elaborates on the previous book. And now, interestingly, when I wrote this book, I used to go to lots of places and read from it to people. And I would say, and now there was this story. And then I'd say, because when I was writing it, it's just like I'm here to speak to you today. And in an hour, I can only tell you so much. But there's so much more that I could tell you, and I have to juggle my way around what bit's going to highlight, right? It was the same with writing the book. So when I started, I said, well, I didn't put it in there, but it was in my head when I was writing it. And as a consequence of all those omitted stories, I was able to write, 10 years later, publish Endangered Tiger, A Community Under Threat. And there's a chapter 2, it's called That Reputation. Because they built a reputation against us. It was very negative, was stigmatized, and we were supposed to be crime-ridden. I'm staying to the point, but I'd just like to say, because before the time is out, that in November, in the Welsh National Opera, Tiger Bay the musical is going to be performed. It's already being performed in South Africa. I've been working with the scriptwriter, because naturally they got their facts wrong. And well, they thought everywhere was Tiger Bay. I said, look, this is the 21st century. If you're going to do this, you must tell it from the perspective of the people who lived it. And then all the false views can be left out, because we've had enough of the negative. And so I was also asked to write the program for the thing. So I put a good, complete history in there, and you'll be able to see that when it comes out. So this is a celebration of Tiger Bay, but it was written for the piece. It takes place between 1898 and 1906, so it's the highlight of the shipping community. Now, the guy who did the script, he was doing research. He hadn't met me, and he was trying to find anything he could on Tiger Bay, and he found this author whose name slips my mind right now. It's a famous author, Arthur something or other, who was from London, and he had this piece, and in the piece was a bit about Tiger Bay. And it was the most sordid thing you could ever read. And so I read it. He liked it because there's a scene in it where, like, the Grenadier Guards or something equivalent to that are down in the slums of Tiger Bay, and they're in this den of iniquity, and everybody's singing, and they're singing songs like Sospen Vark and other Welsh songs. And he just thought that was really great, you know. Or there was Chinese chinks over there doing their opium. There's all this negative descriptions. Not to say there weren't any opium dens. They were there. They were there. But it wasn't like these sordid descriptions that they give. And so I said to him, there's something wrong with this research that you're relying on. It was written in 1865. And 1865 was the first year that a police department was created to patrol the streets of Tiger Bay and the docks. And the author of this was following 2 policemen around. So he comes to a point where he says, and we went down this street, and you could touch the walls with one hand and the other one. I said, well, what street was that down in Tiger Bay where you could do that? Because when I was born, Tiger Bay was the same geographical architectural layout as it was 100 years before when it was built, right? And so there's no street like that I could think of. And then he gave the game away because he was talking about the ladies of the night and this den of iniquity. When you turned the corner and you went into Well-Closed Square, where it was all happening, I said, well, where the hell was Well-Closed Square? I had to go get survey maps. I did everything. I said, I've lived here all my life, and I've never heard of this in our community. It turns out that Well-Closed Square is in London Docks. So it seems as though whatever he saw in London Docks got conflated with what was going on in Cardiff Docks. And so I brought this out to the person who's writing the script for the opera that's coming very soon. So we cleaned all that up and got that all straight. But I was, I've been livid about that kind of material that's been there. So certain things, I'm here now, I can only tell you the highlights. But there were things. Mr. Skyers killed this woman, and he rolled it up in a carpet, and he put it on a pram. It's in the book. And there's people down at Dudley Street, they said that this night they could hear the squeaking wheels of the pram, and this woman whose child had measles happened to be up, and she looked out the window and she could see Mr. Skyers, and then she didn't see what he did with it, but he took the body and he threw it over the seawall, and the sea was supposed to take it away. Only the tide brought her back in. So that became a scandal. Mrs. Volperts got killed in her haberdashery on Bute Street in 1951. I was a young lad. I remember the funeral. I remember everything about it, the scandal. And a Somali seaman of 25 years of age was convicted and hanged. He was the last man in Wales to be hanged for that murder. But nobody in Tiger Bay or the docks believed he did it, which he didn't, because in the 1990s they discovered who did it. And so they had to take his body out of the Cardiff prison, where he was buried in Lye, and buried in the Muslim cemetery in Ely. And if you go there, which I've done, and you look at the stone with his name, Mahmoud Matan, and in gold engraved letters dug into low relief, it says, killed in injustice. But poor Lily didn't deserve to die. So there was that. And then Mr. Shea got shot. And Mr. Shea was an Arab seaman. And in those days, a lot of the seamen were quite intellectual, but they couldn't read English. They knew they were intellectual in their own language, but not in the English language. So the seamen would give him their money for him to send to their families who were living in remote parts of the Yemen and what have you, so they could get water or basic necessities. But the seamen would come back and discover their families didn't get this remuneration, right? And so an argument took place, what have you done with the money? And Mr. Shea was a gambler on the horses, and he had his newspaper with the horses like that, and he was just shooing them off like they was riffraff like that. Well, one of them pulled out a gun and shot him in the head. Oh, I mentioned my sister was working in the civil service, and she would never go the shortcut home. She'd come down the Show of Life, Evangeline Street. She was walking past, and she heard a pop, because it's not like on the movies when a gun goes off. It's nothing, really. She heard this pop. She didn't know what it was. Got home, and then the word was out that somebody had been shot, so everybody come running out to see. So I was home already at lunch, and they said, somebody got shot. So I ran out of the house, run to the corner of Francis Street, and as I get there, all the people are running towards me. Mrs. Evora had a pinafore up, and they're all running away. They're going, you got a gun, you got a gun. But the man was livid about what Mr. Shea did to him, but he wasn't trying to harm anybody else. The police weren't there. It was the local Bay boys, Roy Correa and a few others, that subdued him, right? But then that was an event in their life. So it was this kind of activity was added to the sordidness of the community. So these were the motivations that we said we'd get rid of this community. Now, it wasn't as though murders and other terrible things wasn't happening anywhere else in Cardiff. It's just that they picked on this particular community because it was multi-ethnic. And it was violating all the principles of empire and all these rules where the Darwinian hierarchy, that there was this human race and the blacks was at the bottom and the whites was at the top, and there they are in Tiger Bay all getting married. It's not right, it's not right. So they didn't want that, and that was their motivation. But I go into more detail in the literary part if you read the books. Anything else?
Sorry. You mentioned Joe Erskine and Billy Bob.
Billy Boston.
What about any other sporting legends from
Well, we just lost Johnny Freeman. He played for Halifax. And you know, this is a sad thing because those boys should have played for Welsh teams, but because they were unable, because of their colour, they were unable to be selected for Welsh teams, they ended up... Billy Boston got the key of the door for Wigan. You know, he's very well respected above, as was, in fact, at Johnny Freeman's funeral, the Halifax people came down to do the eulogy in St. Mary's Church in Tiger Bay, which happened under 2 months ago. And then, of course, there's Shirley, there's Lorne Leslie, Patty Flynn. These were all well-known artists and singers. Darky Hughes. I've written about them. I'm sorry if they're not coming out, rolling off my tongue right now, but there's quite a lot of... In that small square mile, a lot of celebrities came from, and you have to look at other things like Ryan Giggs. Most people don't realize that Ryan Giggs isn't really Ryan Giggs, he's Ryan Wilson. His father was Danny Wilson, and he was a fairly famous rugby player, football player in his own right. And his son now is the famous Ryan Giggs. But his great-great-grandfather was an African seaman from Mende called Robert James, right? And so there's a wider connection for the children of the children. The boxer in Ely, Steve Robinson, his mother was from Loudon Square, you know, so there's quite it's often said for such a 1 square mile, such a small place, so many sporting legends and musical legends came out of this one small place. And as I said, I really apologize there. There's a slew of things I could tell you, but not in an hour. You know? Anybody else?
Are there any other questions? Okay.
Oh, can I just say one thing? All my works are available on Amazon. So if you go on Amazon, but you have to put Neil M.C. Sinclair. Otherwise, a million Neil Sinclairs, whoever they are, comes up. But if you put the MC, my middle initials, only my works will come up. And so that way, if you don't purchase anything today, you could still look at them on the computer.
Thank you, Neil. Doug, can I ask you to give a vote of thanks, please?
Can I say one more thing before you do? I know that you put your videos up on YouTube, but if you go on YouTube and look for A Stroll Through Tiger Bay, you'll see me taking people around the bay. It's about a 45-minute video, but I didn't put it up there. Somebody put it up there for me, but everybody thinks it's quite good. So look at that too. Thank you.